It began on an unusually cold October night in a small town tucked away in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else and secrets rarely stay buried for long, but sometimes the darkest things don't come from people at all. Ethan Reynolds was a local high school teacher, recently divorced in his early 30s, who'd moved into a modest, weather-beaten house on the edge of town. The house had been empty for years before he took it, a two-story wooden frame built back in the 1920s with a sagging porch and windows that rattled when the wind blew through the valley. Locals often whispered that it was haunted, but Ethan didn't believe in such things, at least not yet. He moved in at the start of September, just as the trees were shedding their leaves in fiery reds and oranges, and the chill started creeping into the nights. His first few weeks were uneventful, settling in, unpacking boxes, teaching classes, but then the subtle oddities began. At first, it was just small noises. The creaking of floorboards when no one was moving, the faint thud of something falling upstairs, though Ethan had checked every room before bed. Sometimes the lights flickered, though the wiring was supposedly new. He chalked it up to the house's age and the unpredictable mountain weather. One night, about 2 weeks after moving in, Ethan was grading papers at his kitchen table around midnight when he heard it, a soft tapping at the back window. He froze, listening. The rain had stopped and the night was quiet except for the occasional rustling of dry leaves outside. He stood, walked over, and peered out. Nothing. The yard was empty, save for an old oak tree, its gnarled branches silhouetted by the moonlight. He shook his head and went back to his papers. The next morning, he found something odd on the porch, a small, smooth stone painted black, with strange white markings on it. He didn't recognize the symbols. There was no note, no sign of who might have left it. Ethan's first instinct was to assume a prank by local kids. But the town was sleepy, and the nearest neighbors lived half a mile away, and Ethan hadn't seen a soul around at night. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Footsteps echoed upstairs when he was home alone. Doors he had locked would be found slightly ajar. Sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night to cold drafts, despite all the windows being shut tight. His dog, a scrappy terrier named Baxter, began growling at nothing visible, hair raised and low growls rumbling in his throat. One evening, as Ethan was cooking dinner, the power cut out suddenly. He grabbed a flashlight and checked the fuse box, but everything seemed normal. Then he heard it, a low humming sound like distant chanting, faint and eerie, coming from the woods behind the house. He stepped outside, shining his light into the dark forest. Nothing but trees swaying in the wind. He told himself it was his imagination, or maybe a local hunter or kids messing around. The next night, Ethan stayed up late grading papers again. Around 2 a.m., he was startled awake by the sound of a woman's voice, soft, melodic, calling his name. The voice was coming from the hallway outside his bedroom. Heart pounding, he grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping out into the dim corridor. The hallway was empty. He spent the next few minutes searching the house, but found no one. That same night, Baxter began barking uncontrollably at the far end of the hallway. Ethan followed him to the basement door, which he had always kept locked. The dog pawed frantically at the door, whimpering. Against his better judgment, Ethan unlocked the basement door and flicked on the light. The basement was dark and cluttered with old boxes and dusty furniture. Nothing unusual. But when he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A fresh set of footprints in the thin layer of dust on the floor, leading to a far corner of the basement where a loose wooden panel sat slightly ajar. Ethan's heart raced. He crouched down and pried the panel open to reveal a narrow crawl space, pitch black inside. He shone his flashlight in, but the beam vanished into the void. He debated whether to call the police or a friend, but decided to wait until daylight. The next day, he told a coworker about the strange happenings. The coworker, an older man named Jim, looked grave. "You moved into the old Whitaker place, right?" Jim asked. Ethan nodded. "That house has a history. The Whitakers lived there back in the 30s. Old man Whitaker was into some dark stuff. Cults, witchcraft. They say his wife disappeared one night, never found. Some folks claim the place is cursed." Ethan tried to laugh it off, but unease settled deeper. That night, he dreamt of the woman's voice again, this time clearer. She whispered, "Find me." He woke suddenly, drenched in sweat, the basement door creaking softly downstairs. Determined to confront whatever was happening, Ethan grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar and descended into the basement. The crawlspace beckoned, cold and dark. Summoning every ounce of courage, he crawled in. The narrow tunnel stretched back several feet before opening into a hidden chamber. The walls were covered in strange symbols painted in a dark, dried substance. Candles sat half-melted on the floor, and in the center was a small altar, cluttered with bones, old photographs, and dried flowers. On the altar lay a brittle journal. Ethan picked it up, flipping through yellowed pages filled with a trembling hand's writing. It was the diary of Eleanor Whitaker, the missing wife. The entries described isolation, fear, and an increasing sense that something was watching her. The last page was a frantic scrawl pleading for help, mentioning a dark presence that claimed her. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply. Ethan's breath fogged in the beam of his flashlight. A whisper brushed his ear. "Find me." Panicked, he scrambled out of the crawlspace and slammed the panel shut. Back upstairs, the power surged on, the lights flickering wildly. Baxter barked ferociously at the basement door, which now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Ethan realized the presence wasn't just haunting the house, it wanted something from him, something tied to Eleanor's fate. In the following days, Ethan dug into local archives, piecing together the history of the Whitakers. He discovered rumors that Eleanor had tried to escape her husband's dark rituals, but had been trapped in the house, perhaps even killed. More unnerving was a report from an old newspaper of a strange fire in the basement in 1934. Firefighters found nothing but scorched walls and an intense feeling of dread. The house was abandoned ever since until Ethan arrived. One night, the voice returned, this time desperate and urgent. "Help me." Ethan, feeling trapped between fear and curiosity, resolved to find out the truth. He returned to the basement with a camera and audio recorder, determined to capture proof. As he stepped into the hidden chamber, the air grew thick and suffocating. The candles flickered to life spontaneously, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. A figure appeared, translucent, pale, eyes filled with sorrow. Eleanor. Her lips moved, but only silence came through the recorder. Ethan reached out, and she vanished, leaving behind a cold breeze and the overwhelming sense of unfinished business. In the days that followed, Ethan discovered more signs of the supernatural. Objects moved on their own, the shadows seemed to watch, and the whispers became a constant presence. He realized the spirit was trapped by a dark ritual meant to bind her to the house forever. With help from a local historian versed in Appalachian folklore and ritual practices, Ethan began to unravel the Whitaker curse. The ritual had to be reversed at the stroke of midnight on the anniversary of Eleanor's disappearance, October 15th. On that night, Ethan prepared the basement with protective charms and symbols, lighting candles, and reciting the ancient incantations. As the clock struck 12, the temperature plummeted and the air vibrated with a terrible energy. The spirit of Eleanor appeared, her face twisted in pain but hopeful. A dark shadow surged from the walls, resisting the ritual. Ethan struggled to complete the incantation as the shadow lunged, knocking candles over and extinguishing light. With a final shout, Ethan finished the chant. A blinding light exploded, the shadow screamed, then dissolved. The house fell silent. The next morning, the basement was empty, save for the faint scent of burning sage. Eleanor's spirit was free. Ethan moved out shortly after. The house sold to someone else. He never returned. But sometimes late at night, the new owners report hearing soft footsteps and a woman's whisper. "Thank you." Story the end. The first time I noticed something was wrong was late on a Friday night, just after closing the diner where I worked. It was the kind of night where the wind howled through the empty streets and the clouds hung low, threatening rain. I had stayed late cleaning tables and restocking the fridge, eager to get home and crawl into bed. But as I stepped outside into the cold, the street was darker than usual. The streetlights flickered weakly, some completely dead, leaving large patches of blackness between pools of orange light. I locked the diner door behind me, the key clicking sharply in the silence. The parking lot was empty, except for my beat-up old truck, its paint chipped and rusted. I headed to my vehicle, the gravel crunching underfoot, And that's when I caught it. Movement at the edge of the lot, just beyond the faint glow of the nearest street lamp. At first, I thought it was a stray dog, or maybe a raccoon, but whatever it was stood still, too tall and thin to be an animal. It was a figure, hunched over with what looked like long arms dangling almost to its knees. My heart jumped. I froze, staring as the figure's head slowly turned toward me. No face, just a shadow where it should have been. The night air suddenly felt colder, heavier, like the darkness itself was pressing down. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure melted into the blackness between the trees at the far end of the lot. I jumped into my truck and locked the doors, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot faster than I ever had before. On the drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure trailing me, but there was nothing. The next few nights were a blur of exhaustion and unease. Every shadow seemed to twitch, every noise. A branch scraping against my window, the distant howl of a coyote, set my nerves on edge. Then the knocking started. It was always at the same time. 2:17 a.m., sharp and rhythmic. 3 slow knocks, pause, then 2 quick ones. At first, I thought it was the wind against the old wooden porch, but the sound was too precise, too deliberate. I'd freeze, heart pounding, and listen as the knocking faded away. One night, I got brave and peeked out the window. There was no one there, just the empty yard bathed in silver moonlight. But then, when I stepped outside, I found fresh footprints pressed into the damp earth, barefoot and oddly large. They led from the tree line near the edge of my property to the porch, then disappeared. The next day, I asked around the neighborhood, but no one else reported anything strange. I figured maybe it was kids messing with me, though I lived pretty far out of town, and no one walked those roads after dark. Still, I set up some motion-activated lights and an old security camera I had gathering dust in the attic. For a few nights, nothing happened. Then, on the 4th night, the camera captured something. A tall, shadowy figure standing just beyond the porch light's reach, head cocked at an unnatural angle, unmoving like a statue. The footage glitching right before it vanished completely. I showed the video to my sister, who lives a few towns over, and she told me I should leave, that this wasn't normal, that something about the figure felt wrong. But I told her I wasn't going anywhere. This was my home. The following evening, the power went out at 8 p.m., plunging the house into thick darkness. The backup generator kicked in, humming softly in the garage, but all the lights inside stayed dead. Then the knocking began, soft and slow on the back door. I sat frozen on the couch, flashlight trembling in my hand. The knocks grew louder, then suddenly stopped. I crept toward the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing, just the dense blackness of the backyard. Then I heard a whisper, a low, breathy sound just beyond the door. I can't remember what it said, if it was words at all. More like a sigh or a hiss that brushed against my ear. I slammed the door shut and locked it, feeling the weight of something pressing against the other side. That night, I barely slept. When morning came, I found scratches on the doorframe, deep, angry gashes, as if someone had tried to claw their way inside. The marks hadn't been there before. The rest of that week spiraled into something I could hardly believe. The figure showed up almost every night, sometimes at the edge of the woods, sometimes lurking near the windows. Lights flickered, doors creaked open on their own. My phone rang at 2:17 a.m. exactly, but when I answered, all I heard was silence. I started carrying a knife with me, checking locks obsessively, but the feeling of being watched never left. I even called the local sheriff, who came out and walked the property. He told me he found nothing, no footprints, no signs of trespassing, but I knew what I saw. One night, I woke to footsteps inside the house, slow, deliberate, pacing just above my bedroom. I held my breath, clutching the knife, willing the sounds to stop. Then, a whisper, "You can't run." It wasn't human. Not quite. The voice sounded hollow, distant, like it was coming from far beneath the floorboards. The next morning, I packed a bag. I couldn't stay there anymore. I called my sister and told her to meet me halfway between our towns. I didn't care about the job or the house or anything else. All I wanted was to get away. When I pulled out of the driveway, headlights in my rearview mirror made me tense. For a moment, I thought it was the sheriff checking on me again, but the car kept its distance. On the highway, the streetlights flickered in the same rhythm I'd seen that night in the parking lot. 3 quick flashes, pause, 2 long ones. I glanced back again, and the shadowy figure stood on the side of the road, its head tilted, arms hanging low. I hit the gas, heart pounding, but it didn't move. Just watched, waiting. I made it to my sister's house, and for the first time in weeks, I felt safe. But the knocking followed me at 2:17 a.m. every night. Story the end. The cold hit me the moment I stepped out of my car. It was early November, and the air was sharp enough to bite, the kind of cold that makes the hairs on your arms stand up even before you realize it. The small town of Millwood, Ohio was quiet. Too quiet for a Friday night. Streetlights cast long shadows over the cracked pavement, and the occasional rustle of dry leaves was swallowed by the darkness. I was there to pick up my friend Mark from his family's farmhouse and a place I'd never been to before. Mark had been acting strange lately, distant, almost paranoid. He'd called me out of the blue last week, his voice shaky, telling me to come visit him, saying he needed to talk about something important. He refused to explain over the phone. I figured it was just stress from his new job or something personal he was dealing with. But when I pulled up to the house, a rundown 2-story sitting near the edge of a dense forest, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The porch light flickered, casting erratic beams that made the peeling paint look like it was breathing. I knocked, and the door creaked open slowly, revealing Mark's pale face, dark circles under his eyes. "Hey," he said softly, stepping aside to let me in. The inside smelled of damp wood and old smoke. Furniture was sparse and covered in dust sheets, like the place had been abandoned or rarely used. I glanced around, uneasy, as Mark closed the door behind me. "I'm glad you came," he said, leading me into the living room. "I needed someone to see this." On the coffee table lay a stack of faded photographs and several old notebooks. Mark picked up one of the books, its leather cover cracked and worn. "My grandfather left these behind," he said. "He died a few years ago. I found these journals while cleaning out the attic." He flipped through the pages, revealing detailed accounts of strange happenings around the property, odd noises, mysterious figures seen in the woods, unexplained disappearances in the nearby town over the past century. Mark's voice lowered. "I thought it was just old folklore, but now I'm not so sure." He told me about the nights when people would hear footsteps on the porch, even though no one was there. How shadows would move just out of sight, and how some locals refused to come near the property after dark. As he spoke, a sudden chill swept through the room, and the lights flickered again. I looked toward the window, where the dark forest pressed against the glass, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a figure watching us. Mark noticed too. His eyes widened. "Did you see that?" Before I could answer, a sharp knock echoed at the front door. We froze. "No one should be here," Mark whispered. The knocking came again, louder and more urgent. Mark grabbed a flashlight and moved cautiously toward the door. I followed, heart pounding. He opened the door slowly, shining the beam into the night. The yard was empty. "Must have been an animal," Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction. We locked the door and returned inside. Minutes later, the temperature dropped sharply. The breath I exhaled fogged in the air. Then came the sound, soft, dragging footsteps circling the house. They stopped abruptly outside Mark's bedroom window. We exchanged terrified glances as a faint tapping began, rhythmic and deliberate. Mark backed away. "I don't think we're alone." Suddenly, the power cut out, plunging us into darkness. The tapping grew louder, closer. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noises stopped. The lights flickered back on. We rushed to check the windows. Nothing. But on the porch, written in the dirt, was a single word: leave. I never went back. Story the end. It was late October 2012 when I decided to move into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town in rural Ohio. I'd grown up in the city, Detroit actually, but after my parents passed away unexpectedly within months of each other, I wanted nothing more than to disappear somewhere quiet, someplace that didn't remind me of the chaos and loss. The farmhouse was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I didn't care. I was desperate for a fresh start, and I thought the isolation might help me heal. The house was a creaky 2-story structure, built sometime in the late 1800s. It sat on 5 acres of overgrown land, with a rusted barn in the back and a small creek running near the edge of the property. The previous owner had died years earlier, and the house had been vacant since. I bought it as is, the realtor assuring me it only needed some TLC. I was naive. The place was worse than that. The first few nights passed with only the usual old house noises, creaking floorboards, pipes groaning in the walls, the wind rattling the windows. I told myself I was being paranoid when I felt watched or heard muffled sounds I couldn't explain. It was just the house settling, or maybe my own mind playing tricks on me. That changed one night, about a week after moving in. I was lying in bed reading when I heard a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the radio, but there was no device on. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, but I still couldn't make out what was being said. Then, footsteps, soft but deliberate, came from the hallway outside my bedroom door. I froze, heart pounding, but the door didn't open. The footsteps paced slowly back and forth for what felt like minutes, then stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I found strange scratches on the wooden floor outside my door, thin, jagged lines that looked like claws. I had no pets and no explanation. Days later, while cleaning the basement, I found an old trunk filled with brittle letters and faded photographs. Most were from a woman named Margaret, dated around 1910. The letters spoke of loneliness, fear, and a man named Thomas, who had become something else. One letter mentioned the darkness beneath the house and begged for forgiveness. I felt a chill reading them. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began to research the house's history. I learned that Thomas was the original owner and that his wife Margaret and daughter Clara had vanished without explanation over a century ago. Rumors whispered of madness, possession, and tragedy, but no official records explained their disappearance. One night, the whispering returned, louder and clearer. I could swear I heard my name being called. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound to the attic door, which was supposed to be sealed shut. To my surprise, it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and climbed the narrow stairs into the darkness. The attic was cold and smelled like decay. Amidst broken furniture and dust-covered boxes, I saw faint outlines of small footprints leading to a corner where the wood was rotted away. Suddenly, I felt a freezing breath on the back of my neck and a soft voice whispered, "Help us." I spun around but saw nothing. Terrified, I fled the attic and bolted the door behind me. Over the next few nights, I was plagued by nightmares, visions of Margaret and Clara trapped beneath the house, screaming silently as something monstrous lurked in the shadows. One evening, I heard a child crying from the basement. When I went down, the lights flickered and I saw a pale girl standing in the corner, her eyes hollow, her dress torn. I called out, but she vanished. Determined to end whatever was haunting me, I sought help from a local priest. He came with holy water and prayers, but as soon as he entered the house, his face went pale. He refused to stay overnight. "Something evil dwells here," he said quietly. "It feeds on sorrow and pain." The final straw came on a stormy night when the house shook violently. Doors slammed, windows shattered, and a low growl echoed through the walls. I barely escaped with my life as the barn caught fire mysteriously. I left everything behind and never returned. To this day, I wonder if the spirits of Margaret and Clara found peace, or if the darkness beneath that old farmhouse still waits for the next soul to claim. Story the end. The night was unusually still that October evening in northern Michigan. The kind of silence that seemed unnatural, like the world was holding its breath for something nobody wanted to admit was coming. I was driving home from a weekend trip to visit my parents. A 2-hour drive down a winding country highway that cut through dense forests with hardly any other cars or streetlights to break up the darkness. It was around 11:45 p.m. when my headlights caught something strange on the side of the road. A figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, almost blending into the shadows. I slowed down instinctively. It was a man, middle-aged, dressed in old tattered clothing that looked like it hadn't seen a washer in years. His face was gaunt, pale, with eyes that seemed hollow, like deep pits that sucked the light out of the world around him. For a moment, I thought he might need help. I rolled down my window and called out, "Hey, are you okay? Need a ride?" He didn't answer. He didn't even blink or move, just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. I wanted to help him, but something felt wrong. A primal fear pushed me back into the driver's seat. I hit the gas and drove past him quickly, my heart hammering. As I passed, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure hadn't moved. He was still standing there, watching. The rest of the drive home felt like a nightmare. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the man walking behind my car or somehow appearing in my path again. But the road was empty. The fog had rolled in thick now, blurring the edges of the trees, turning the night into an endless gray sea. When I pulled into my driveway, I locked the doors and sat for a moment, trying to calm down. The house was old, a small, creaky farmhouse I'd inherited from my grandparents. I told myself I was just tired that the man was probably a homeless person or someone lost. But then the weird things started. That first night, I was lying in bed when I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, moving from one side to the other. I peeked through the window blinds. Nothing there. The porch light was off, but I could see the faint outline of something dark moving just beyond the glass. I grabbed a baseball bat and opened the door quickly, shining my flashlight around. No one. The only thing out there was a set of muddy footprints, wet and fresh, leading from the edge of the yard to the front step, and then disappearing into the trees. I cleaned the porch, locked every window and door, and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those empty eyes staring back at me, the figure from the road. Over the next few days, the footsteps continued at night, always on the porch or circling the house. The prints never matched any shoe size I could recognize. Some were huge, others tiny, like a child's. One evening, my power went out. The whole town was dark. I lit some candles and sat in the living room, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, I heard a voice, barely a whisper, coming from the hallway. Leave. My skin crawled. I turned on my flashlight and walked toward the sound. The hallway was empty. No one there. The voice came again, clearer this time. Leave. I grabbed my phone to call for help. No signal. I sat down, trying to think. What was going on? Was I losing my mind? Then, from behind me, I heard the slow creak of the floorboards. I spun around. A figure stood in the shadows, tall, thin, wearing that same tattered coat and wide-brimmed hat. His face was gone. Or rather, it was a dark, shifting void where a face should be. No eyes, no mouth, just an empty blackness that seemed to suck the light out of the room. I screamed and swung the bat, but my arms passed right through him. He whispered again, a voice like wind through dead leaves. You cannot stay. The candles flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. I ran outside into the cold night, but the fog had thickened into a wall. When I looked back, the figure was standing at the door, watching me. The next morning, the police came after I called from a neighbor's house. They found no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no damage. I told them about the figure, the voice, the footsteps, but they just chalked it up to stress or sleep deprivation. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed my bags and left town. But even now, years later, I can't forget those empty eyes. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone and the house is silent, I swear I hear the whisper. Leave. Story the end. It was a late October evening when I found myself driving down a stretch of highway I had never taken before. I was on my way back home from a business trip, my mind still clouded with the stress of meetings and missed flights. The GPS on my phone suggested a shortcut, a route through some small towns and country roads, which would shave off about 30 minutes from my trip. Not wanting to waste any time, I agreed to the detour. The sun had just set, and the sky was painted in deep purples and navy blues. My car's headlights cut through the early creeping fog that was beginning to gather along the roadside. I was driving through rural Pennsylvania, the landscape dotted with abandoned farmhouses and thick clusters of trees that looked like they had been untouched for decades. I noticed my fuel gauge dipping dangerously low. The nearest gas station the GPS indicated was in a town called Green Hollow. The name itself gave me an uneasy feeling, but I told myself it was just the exhaustion messing with my head. As I drove into Green Hollow, I realized it was one of those towns frozen in time. The streets were deserted, and the few houses I saw looked weather-beaten and neglected. The gas station was a small, rundown building with flickering neon signs that barely lit up the place. I pulled in and noticed the pumps weren't working. The lights inside the store were dim, and the door was slightly ajar. I stepped out of the car and called inside, but no one answered. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for October. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of a dog barking, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I decided to check around the building. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the gas station, there was a narrow path leading into the woods. A faint light flickered deep among the trees, almost like a lantern or candle. Curious, I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and headed toward the path, telling myself it was probably someone camping or a small gathering. But as I stepped into the woods, the fog thickened, swallowing the path behind me. The trees towered overhead, their branches twisting and intertwining like skeletal fingers. The light flickered again, and I moved closer, heart pounding. I heard voices, low and muffled, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The air smelled of smoke and something else, something metallic. Suddenly, I stumbled into a clearing. There in the center was a circle of stones, and inside it stood several figures cloaked in dark robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They were chanting in unison, their voices rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. I froze, realizing I had stumbled into something I wasn't meant to see. One of the figures turned sharply toward me, and I caught a glimpse of pale skin and eyes that shone unnaturally bright in the dim light. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run. Branches whipped against my face as I pushed through the underbrush, the chanting growing louder behind me, echoing through the trees. I didn't dare look back until I burst onto the road. I ran to my car, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands shook as I started the engine, eyes darting around, expecting those glowing eyes to appear in my rearview mirror. I sped away from Green Hollow, the road stretching out endlessly before me, the fog clinging like a shroud. When I finally reached home hours later, I locked every door and window, but sleep didn't come easy. That night, I was awoken by a scratching sound at my bedroom window. Heart racing, I turned on the light and looked outside, but there was nothing there. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Lights flickered, shadows moved at the edge of my vision, and the faint smell of smoke would drift through the house. I found strange symbols scratched into the wooden floor near my bed, though I was sure they hadn't been there before. I tried to tell myself it was stress or exhaustion, but the unease grew stronger. One evening, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a small, leather-bound book filled with handwritten notes and drawings of symbols identical to those in my house. The first page contained a chilling message. The circle watches, and it calls for you. I realized then that whatever I had witnessed in Green Hollow was not just a random gathering, but something much darker and more dangerous. I contacted the local authorities to report the gas station and the strange happenings, but they told me there was no record of Green Hollow existing, no town by that name, no gas station, nothing. I started to question my own sanity, but the tapping continued every night, growing louder, more insistent. I'm writing this now, hoping someone will read it, hoping that if you ever find yourself near Green Hollow, or any place where the fog thickens and the silence is too complete, don't follow the light into the woods, because once you're marked, there's no escape. Story the end. That night started like any other for me. I worked as a security guard for a warehouse on the outskirts of a small town in Ohio. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it paid the bills and allowed me to keep my nights free, which I preferred. The warehouse was old, built back in the 1940s, with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings that echoed every sound. It sat near the woods, separated from the nearest houses by a stretch of empty fields. On this particular night, the moon was full, casting a pale glow over the cracked parking lot. I was stationed inside the security office, a small room with windows overlooking the loading docks and the front entrance. The building had cameras in every corner, but sometimes I liked to do rounds on foot, just to stay alert. It was just past midnight when I decided to head out. I locked the door behind me and grabbed my flashlight. The air was cold, sharp with the scent of damp earth and rusting metal. I followed the usual path through the warehouse aisles, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Stacks of crates loomed on either side like silent sentinels. Nothing seemed out of place until I reached the rear loading dock. There, I noticed the large metal door to the back alley was slightly ajar. That wasn't right. The policy was to keep it locked at all times to prevent theft. I approached cautiously, my heart picking up pace. I pushed the door gently and it creaked open further. A cold breeze swept in, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and something else. Something rotten. I stepped outside, flashlight raised, eyes scanning the shadowy alley. The yard beyond the dock was empty except for some old pallets stacked against the fence. The trees from the nearby woods loomed just beyond the chain link, their branches scratching against the sky. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, like whispering voices coming from the woods. I froze. The voices were too low to make out words, but they were definitely human, or something close. I shone my flashlight into the tree line, but the darkness swallowed the beam quickly. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe some animals. I locked the door again and went back inside, trying to shake the feeling of unease. As I walked down the hall toward the office, the warehouse lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The emergency backup kicked in, bathing the building in a sickly yellow glow. The flickering made the shadows dance across the walls. I hurried back to the security office and sat down at the monitors. All cameras showed normal, except one, the camera covering the back alley where the door had been open. The screen was static, crackling with interference. I called the main office on my radio, but got no answer. I tried my cell phone, no signal. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate footsteps. I whipped around, flashlight sweeping the room. Nothing, just the empty warehouse. I tried to steady my breathing. Maybe it was just the building settling. I turned back to the monitors. Suddenly, on the broken camera feed, a figure appeared. At first, just a blurry silhouette, but then it became clearer. A man, or something that looked like one, standing motionless in the dark alley. The figure's face was obscured by shadows, but I felt its gaze piercing through the screen, right at me. I froze. Then the figure raised a hand and pointed directly at the camera. The screen went black. I slammed my fist on the desk and grabbed my radio again. "Dispatch, this is night security. I'm seeing some kind of intruder on the back lot. Requesting backup immediately." No response. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back toward the exit. The warehouse felt alive. The wooden floors creaked with every step, but no wind blew through the sealed doors. I reached the back door again. It was wide open. The alley was empty, the night silent except for the rustling of leaves. I stepped outside, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. I felt eyes watching me from the woods. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight into the trees. There! A pair of glowing eyes blinked at me from the shadows. I froze, heart pounding. The eyes disappeared. I turned back to the warehouse, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Trapped outside, I glanced up at the moonlit sky. The woods around me seemed to close in. Suddenly the whispering voices returned, louder now, echoing from every direction. "Help us. Join us." My skin crawled. I ran along the fence line, searching for a gate or a way out. That's when I saw it. An old trail leading into the forest. No other choice. I plunged into the trees, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The whispering followed me, growing into a chorus of desperate cries. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the cold night pressing down. After what felt like hours, I burst out of the woods onto a deserted country road. I flagged down a passing car. The driver was a woman in her 50s. I told her everything, the warehouse, the figure, the voices. She listened carefully. "Red Hollow Woods," she said. "You got lucky getting out of there. People avoid that place. Stories of disappearances, strange happenings." I asked her if she knew anything about the warehouse. She nodded. "That place was built on the site of an old asylum. They shut it down after the patients vanished. Some say their spirits never left." I thanked her and called the police. They investigated the warehouse the next day, but found no evidence of anyone or anything suspicious. The warehouse had no records of a back door being left open, no reports of intruders, only me and my story. I quit that job the same week, but the nightmares haunt me still. At night, I hear whispers just beyond my bedroom window, soft, pleading voices calling my name. I never go near Red Hollow Woods again. because sometimes when the wind blows just right, I swear I see those glowing eyes watching me from the dark. Story the end. The night my nightmare began wasn't one I would have expected to change my life forever. I just accepted a seasonal job as a night janitor at the old Willow Creek Hotel, a historic building tucked away in a forgotten corner of upstate New York. It had been shut down for years, left to rot after a series of strange incidents and mysterious disappearances. But the company that owned the property wanted to renovate it, so they hired temporary workers like me to clean and prep the place. The hotel was massive, 4 stories of peeling wallpaper, cracked plaster, and creaky floorboards. It smelled of damp wood and mildew, with that faint, unplaceable scent that old buildings get, like memories trapped in dust. I arrived just before midnight and was told to start on the 3rd floor, sweeping and mopping the long corridors and empty rooms. The first few hours were uneventful. I listened to music on my headphones, humming along, trying not to think about the silence. But then, as I passed room 312, I heard something, a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was just a loose shutter banging outside in the wind, but it persisted, 3 slow, deliberate taps. I stopped and listened. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Suddenly, a cold draft brushed past me, though every window was shut tight. I pulled my jacket closer and decided to check the room. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and shone my flashlight inside. The room was empty except for a single chair facing the wall. No signs of anyone having been there recently. I shrugged and moved on. Later, as I was cleaning the lobby, I noticed faint footprints in the dust, small, childlike, leading up the grand staircase to the 2nd floor. The hotel had been closed for years, that no one else should have been inside. That night, strange noises echoed through the halls, whispers, creaks, footsteps. I told myself it was the building settling, my mind playing tricks. But when I heard a woman crying softly from room 217, I knew something was very wrong. I approached slowly. The door was closed but not locked. I knocked, and the crying stopped abruptly. I pushed the door open. The room was cold and empty. The next night, I found an old diary tucked behind a loose brick in the basement wall. The entries told of a tragic love story. A woman named Margaret who had lost her child in the hotel during a fire decades ago. As the days went on, the apparitions became clearer. Shadows flitted at the edge of my vision. A child's laughter echoed in empty corridors. One night, the crying came again, louder, desperate. I followed the sound to the attic, where I found a small, charred cradle. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and a translucent figure of a woman appeared, eyes filled with sorrow. She reached out, whispering, "Find her." I realized then that the hotel was haunted by more than memories. It was a prison for restless spirits seeking peace. I called in paranormal experts, but nothing could prepare me for what came next. The spirits grew angry, manifesting violently, objects flying, doors slamming. One night, trapped in the attic, I faced the apparition of Margaret, who revealed that her child's soul was trapped beneath the hotel in the old boiler room. With trembling hands, I helped perform a ritual to release the child's spirit. The air lightened, the oppressive weight lifted. The hotel's hauntings ceased. I left Willow Creek soon after, haunted by what I'd seen, but grateful to have survived. Sometimes when the wind howls just right, I swear I hear a child's laughter carried on the breeze. Story the end. The day I started to realize things weren't normal, it was just a few hours before sunset. I had been driving home from a business trip in Vermont, the road long and winding through the dense forests and mountains that seemed endless. The sun was already dipping low when my phone battery died and the GPS went dark. I was about to take a shortcut through some back roads I hadn't traveled before, hoping it would shave at least an hour off the trip. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 cars, and the trees pressed in on both sides. It was quiet, too quiet for that time of day. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of tires on the gravel. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a car behind me, keeping pace, but when I checked again a minute later, it was gone. That was the first moment something felt off. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the other driver had turned off the road or stopped somewhere. I kept driving, the gravel road twisting and turning until it opened up to a clearing. Ahead, I spotted an old gas station, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The sign flickered weakly, and the pumps were covered in rust. I pulled up to the station, hoping to find a working payphone or maybe some kind of help. But the place was deserted. The windows were grimy, the door locked tight. There was no sign of life. I checked my pockets for change to try the payphone outside, but it was broken. As I turned back to my car, I heard a noise behind me, a faint scraping sound. I spun around, but nothing was there, just the empty road stretching back into the woods. That's when I saw the figure. At first, it was just a shadow, tall and thin, standing beneath the flickering light of the gas station sign. As I stared, the shape became clearer. A man, wearing a long coat, his face hidden in the darkness beneath a wide-brimmed hat. I called out, but he didn't move. His head tilted slightly unnaturally as if watching me. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I jumped into my car and locked the doors, but before I could start the engine, the man was suddenly at the passenger side window, tapping on the glass. I stared at him, breath caught in my throat. His eyes were empty sockets. No whites, no pupils, just blackness. The tapping grew more urgent, more frantic. I hit the accelerator and peeled out of the station. Gravel sprang behind me. As I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him again, standing at the edge of the gas station parking lot. Only now there were others. Figures, emerging from the trees, their faces just as empty and void. I didn't stop until I reached a small town, lights and people everywhere. But even there, the sense of being watched followed me. When I checked into a motel that night, I found a note slipped under my door. "Did you forget us?" I tore it up, but the feeling never left. Over the next week, wherever I went, the grocery store, my hotel room, even on the crowded streets, I saw glimpses of those empty-eyed figures lurking just out of sight. One night, I woke to find scratches on my bedroom window. Deep, long gouges, like claws had raked the glass. Outside, the street was empty and silent. The next day, I tried to tell anyone, but no one believed me. A nervous traveler with a vivid imagination, they said. But I knew the truth. The emptiness in those eyes wasn't just darkness, it was something worse. They weren't human, and they never forgot. Story the end. The first time I saw the old man, I was about 9 years old, riding my bike down the cracked sidewalk of our neighborhood in upstate New York. It was late autumn, October, maybe November, and the air had that biting chill that made your breath visible in little puffs. Leaves crunched beneath my wheels as I pedaled past the rows of modest houses, their front yards cluttered with orange pumpkins and wilting mums. The man was standing just beyond the chain-link fence of the house at the end of my street, the one everyone called the haunted house. I'd heard the stories, of course. The house had been empty for years, ever since the last family moved out under mysterious circumstances. Some kids whispered that the place cursed, that strange noises came from inside after dark. Others said the previous owners had disappeared without a trace. My parents told me to stay away, but curiosity always gets the better of kids. The old man was thin and hunched, with wild white hair that stuck out in all directions. His clothes were ragged, and he clutched a gnarled walking stick that looked like it had been carved from some ancient tree. But what unsettled me most was his eyes. They were too bright, too sharp, like they saw everything, even things that weren't there. He didn't say anything as I rode by, just watched me silently. That night, when I told my parents about him, they exchanged worried glances but dismissed it as my imagination. I wanted to believe them. Days passed, and the old man appeared again, always near the haunted house, never moving but always watching. Then strange things started happening around the neighborhood. It began with small disappearances, pets first. My neighbor's cat vanished, then another dog down the street. No one found any clues, no signs of struggle, just empty collars and broken toys left behind. People started locking their doors tighter, keeping their kids indoors after dark. The old man was still there, a constant presence, never speaking, always watching. One night I heard knocking on my bedroom window. I froze, staring at the glass, heart pounding. The knocking continued, soft, slow, deliberate. I summoned the courage to look, but there was nothing but darkness and the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. Over the next few weeks, the knocking became more frequent, moving to the front door, the back door, sometimes even the walls inside the house. At school, kids whispered about shadows that followed them home, voices that called their names in the dark. Adults tried to explain it away as stress or imagination, but the fear was real. Then the old man disappeared. Without warning, one morning he was gone. The haunted house was silent again, and the neighborhood felt empty, like a breath held too long and then released. But the sense of dread lingered, thick as fog. One evening I stayed up late, unable to sleep. I heard footsteps outside, slow and heavy, circling the house. I peeked through the curtains and saw a shadow moving just beyond the porch light, too tall to be any of the neighbors. It stopped, and for a moment I thought I saw glowing eyes staring back. I told my parents, but they said it was just a raccoon or a stray dog. I wanted to believe them, but the fear had taken root. Weeks later, my best friend disappeared. No one ever found him. The neighborhood slowly emptied as families moved away, scared of the unseen presence that haunted our streets. The haunted house was boarded up, the windows painted over, but the feeling of being watched never left. Sometimes late at night, I still hear the knocking, 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 quick ones, coming from the shadows outside my window. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see those bright, sharp eyes watching from the darkness. Story the end. It was the summer of 2016 when everything changed for me. I was 27, working as a paramedic in a small town in northern Michigan, one of those places where everyone knows everyone else, and the nights are long and quiet except for the occasional distant call of an ambulance or police siren. I liked the job, the adrenaline, the rush of saving lives, but that summer, something else came rushing in. A nightmare that I still can't shake. It started with a call out on a routine evening. I was driving the ambulance with my partner, Jenna, when we got dispatched to a house just outside town near the edge of the forest. The call was vague. Possible overdose, unconscious male. Pretty standard, nothing too unusual. When we arrived, the house looked deserted, the kind of place you'd pass and think no one lived there anymore. The paint was peeling, the lawn overgrown, windows dark. We knocked, called out, but there was no answer. As we prepared to leave, the door creaked open a crack, and I caught sight of a man inside, slumped over a table, his face hidden in shadows. We rushed in. The man was barely breathing, pale and cold. I checked his pulse. It was weak. Jenna started prepping the oxygen while I searched for any signs of what had happened. That's when I saw it, a wall covered in strange symbols, scrawled in what looked like blood. The air inside felt heavy, suffocating, like the house was holding its breath. The man suddenly gasped and sat up, eyes wild and unfocused. "They're coming," he whispered. "You can't stop them." Before I could ask who they were, he collapsed again. We loaded him into the ambulance and raced back to the hospital. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing whispers, shadows flickering in the corners of my vision. Jenna said she felt the same. Over the next few days, calls to that area kept coming. Disturbances, strange noises, reports of people disappearing. The town started to buzz with rumors of something old and dark waking up in the woods. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. One night, as I drove home alone, the radio suddenly cut out. My headlights flickered, and in the distance, between the trees, I saw figures. Tall, twisted silhouettes moving just beyond the edge of the road. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. But when I looked again, they were gone. From that moment, everything changed. The calls got worse. Screams in the night, shadows crossing windows, people vanishing without a trace. I started seeing those figures everywhere, in the hospital halls, outside my window, even in my dreams. I tried to tell the police, but no one believed me. They said it was stress, exhaustion, maybe even hallucinations. But I knew what I saw was real. One night, I woke to find the room freezing cold. A dark shape stood at the foot of my bed, watching. I couldn't move or scream. It leaned closer, and I could see its eyes. Empty, black holes that swallowed the light. Then it whispered my name. That's when I ran. I left the town, left the job, left everything behind, but the darkness followed me. Even now, years later, I still feel it watching, waiting. It's not just a nightmare. It's real. And it's coming back. Story, the end. The first time it happened, I thought it was just my imagination. I was alone in my apartment late at night, the kind of late night when the silence seems so thick it presses against your skin. I lived in an older building in Detroit, a brick structure from the early 1900s with creaky floors, thin walls, and a history nobody ever talked about. I had moved in just a few months earlier, right after I got a new job at a local newspaper. It was a decent place, affordable, close to work. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. That night I was reading in the living room, the only light coming from a small lamp beside the couch, when I heard it. A faint scratching noise coming from the wall behind the bookshelf. At first I thought maybe a mouse or a rat. This part of town wasn't the best, after all, but the noise was off. It wasn't random. It sounded deliberate. Slow, rhythmic, like someone was tapping on the wall, trying to get attention. Uh, Paused, ears straining. The silence returned, but my heart was already racing. I got up and pulled the bookshelf away from the wall. Behind it was just the exposed brick. No holes, no gaps, nothing that could explain the noise. I shrugged it off and went back to my book. But every night after that, the scratching returned. Sometimes it was accompanied by faint whispers, too soft to understand, but unmistakably human. I started sleeping with a knife on my bedside table. One night, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My bedroom window rattled violently, even though the wind outside was calm. I looked toward the window and saw a dark figure standing outside on the fire escape. It was too tall to be a normal person, with limbs that seemed wrong. The figure just stared at me through the glass. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. Then it vanished. The police came after I called, but there was no sign anyone had been there. No footprints on the fire escape, no fingerprints on the glass. Nothing. The landlord shrugged it off as kids playing pranks, but I knew better. Things escalated. Objects moved on their own. My keys would disappear, only to be found in the freezer. My phone would turn on by itself, displaying static or showing pictures I hadn't taken. Shadowy silhouettes standing in corners, eyes glowing faintly. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone breathing heavily right next to me. I reached out, but no one was there. My sheets were tangled, like something had been gripping them tight. I decided to set up a camera in my bedroom. The next morning, I watched the footage. At exactly 3:13 a.m., a shadow moved across the room. It paused at the foot of the bed, and a whisper echoed, "Get out." I felt cold, like the room had turned into ice. I deleted the footage and unplugged the camera. Desperate for answers, I visited the local library and dug into the history of my building. What I found was unsettling. The building had once been a boarding house in the 1920s. One tenant, a man named Harold Whitman, had been accused of murder. His wife and child had disappeared without a trace. Neighbors whispered he was involved in occult rituals. After he was arrested, he committed suicide in his apartment. Some said his spirit never left. I never believed in ghosts before. But now, I wasn't so sure. One night, as I was leaving my apartment, I heard a voice call my name from the hallway. I looked out, but the hallway was empty. The lights flickered and a cold draft blew through. I started seeing the figure again, the tall, distorted man from the fire escape. This time he was inside my apartment, standing at the window, watching me with hollow eyes. I felt like I was losing my mind. I reached out to a paranormal investigator, a woman named Lisa, who had a reputation for dealing with restless spirits. She came over one evening with equipment, EMF detectors, infrared cameras, and salt for protection. We did a sweep of the apartment. The devices went haywire near the bedroom wall. Lisa said, "This is a hot spot. Whatever's here is attached to this place." She told me the spirit was likely Harold Whitman, trapped by his own dark deeds. We performed a cleansing ritual, burning sage and chanting prayers. The temperature dropped, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like invisible hands squeezing. Then silence. For a week, nothing happened. But then I found a note on my door, written in a shaky hand. "Leave before it's too late." I didn't want to give up my home, but I knew I had to. One last night, I packed my things. As I turned off the lights, I saw Harold standing at the foot of my bed, eyes burning with rage. I didn't look back as I left. The building sits empty now. Sometimes, people who walk by say they hear scratching and whispering from within the walls. And if you listen closely, you might hear Harold calling your name. Story the end. The night I moved into my first apartment alone, I thought it was just the usual jitters, the mix of excitement and nerves that comes with starting fresh in a new place. The building was an old converted factory on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, a brick structure from the early 1900s that had been repurposed into lofts. It was affordable, close to work, and gave me the independence I craved after years of living with my parents. The landlord was an older man, quiet but friendly enough. He gave me a quick tour, showing me the fire escapes, the laundry room, and warning me about the creaky floors and drafty windows. "Old buildings have character," he said with a wink. At first, everything felt normal. The apartment was spacious with high ceilings, exposed pipes, and large windows that overlooked a deserted alley, the kind of place where you could feel the history pressing against the walls. That first night, I unpacked slowly, arranging my things, trying to make the place feel like home. Around midnight, I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door. I froze, heart pounding. I told myself it was just the old building settling, or maybe another tenant in the hall. But when I got up to check, the hallway was empty and silent. The next few nights, the footsteps continued, soft, deliberate, pacing just outside my door. Sometimes I heard whispers, so faint I couldn't catch the words. I asked the landlord about it, but he just laughed it off. "Old buildings do that. Don't let it get to you." But it did get to me. One night, I woke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open slowly. I sat frozen, unable to move or scream. The door stopped halfway, and I saw a shadow slip through the crack. I bolted out of bed, switching on the lights, but there was no one there. I checked every corner, every closet, but the apartment was empty. I started locking the door with extra bolts and latches, but the noises continued. One evening, I found a small, antique-looking key on the floor near the window. I had no idea where it came from. It looked old, with strange markings etched into the metal. Curious and unnerved, I asked the landlord if he knew anything about it. He went pale. "You shouldn't have that." "What is it?" I asked. "It belonged to the previous tenant. She disappeared. Left the key behind." I pressed for more information, but he changed the subject quickly. That night, I had nightmares of a woman in a white dress, her face hidden by long dark hair, standing at the foot of my bed, holding that same key. She whispered, "Find the door." Determined to make sense of it, I searched the apartment for a locked door or hidden compartment. Behind a loose panel in the hallway, I found a small locked door, about the size of a cabinet. I tried the key. It fit perfectly. Inside, I discovered a dusty, narrow staircase leading down. I grabbed a flashlight and descended into the darkness. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth. The stairs ended in a small, windowless room with bare stone walls. In the center stood an old wooden chest covered in cobwebs. I opened it slowly and found old letters, photographs, and a diary. The diary belonged to a woman named Evelyn, who had lived in the apartment decades ago. Her entries were disturbing. She wrote about hearing voices, seeing shadows, and feeling watched. She mentioned a man named Samuel who had moved in after her and had disappeared mysteriously. The last entry was a frantic warning. "He's here. Don't trust the shadows." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. The room plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered and died. I felt breath on my neck, cold and heavy. I screamed and pounded on the door until it finally opened. I scrambled upstairs, locked the hidden door, and never went back down. The apartment seemed quieter after that, but the feeling of being watched never left. I moved out a month later. Years passed. I found out that Samuel had been a violent man, obsessed with Evelyn. He had vanished without a trace, but rumors said he never left the building. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear footsteps outside my bedroom door. Story, the end. It was the first winter after my divorce, and I was still getting used to the silence. The house I'd rented was too big for just me. A three-bedroom farmhouse sitting alone at the edge of a disused county road in upstate New York. The landlord told me it had been empty for nearly 6 years before I moved in, but he didn't say why, and I didn't ask. The rent was cheap, the place was clean enough, and I figured I could make it feel like home. The first week was uneventful. The nights were long, cold, and quiet, broken only by the groan of the old radiator and the occasional howl of wind sweeping across the open fields. I kept to a routine: work during the day, home by 6, cook, watch TV, bed. The only thing I noticed was how dark it got after sunset. Out here, there were no streetlights, no neighboring porch lights, just blackness pressing up against the windows like a living thing. It was on the 8th night that something shifted. I was in bed, drifting between sleep and waking, when I heard what I thought was the sound of footsteps upstairs. I froze, trying to remind myself there was no upstairs, just an empty attic I hadn't even been inside yet. The sound came again, deliberate, slow, like someone walking across wooden boards. I told myself it was the house settling. Old houses creak, especially in the cold. I rolled over and forced my eyes shut. The next morning, I noticed something odd. The attic door, an old square panel in the hallway ceiling, was slightly ajar. I hadn't touched it. I didn't even own a ladder tall enough to reach it. I stood there staring at it for longer than I care to admit, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been like that when I moved in and I just never noticed. That night, the footsteps returned. They came closer, ending right above my bedroom. I lay completely still, barely breathing, listening. There was a long pause and then 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the ceiling. I didn't sleep after that. The following day, I borrowed a ladder from work. The attic entrance was stiff, but I managed to push it open and shine a flashlight inside. Dust floated in the beam of light, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. The space was empty. No furniture, no boxes, no signs of animals. But as I stepped up, the floorboards groaned under my weight in the exact same way they had the night before. I was about to climb back down when I saw it. A single set of footprints in the dust, leading from the attic entrance to the far corner where the roof sloped low. They were bare footprints. Human. The strangest part was that there were no prints coming back. I searched that corner, but found nothing. No hidden door, no crawl space, just bare wood and cobwebs. Uneasy, I climbed down, closed the attic, and told myself it was probably from a previous tenant, left there years ago. The next few nights, I heard nothing. I started to think I'd imagined it all. But then, just before 2 a.m. on a Thursday, I woke to the sound of breathing. It wasn't mine. It was coming from inside the bedroom. I sat up slowly, straining to hear over the pounding in my ears. The sound was faint but unmistakable, slow, steady breaths just a few feet away. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow in the far corner, taller than the dresser, motionless. I reached for the lamp, but the moment my hand brushed the switch, the breathing stopped. I turned on the light. The corner was empty. The next morning, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The attic door was wide open. From then on, things escalated. Small at first, a cupboard door left open, the TV turning on by itself, items I was sure I'd left in one place showing up somewhere else. Then came the nights where I'd wake up to find my bedroom door standing wide open, even though I locked it before bed. One night, after hearing faint shuffling above me, I decided to stay up and listen. Around 1:47 a.m., the sounds began, footsteps in the attic, moving slowly, deliberately. They stopped above my bedroom again. My skin prickled, and I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed. I don't know what I was planning to do. There was no way I was climbing up there in the dark. The footsteps moved again toward the hall. Then came the sound of the attic door creaking open. I held my breath. A moment later, I heard the ladder I'd borrowed weeks earlier being dragged across the floor. I hadn't left it there. I'd returned it. And then, from the hallway outside my room, 3 soft knocks on the door. I don't remember falling asleep that night. In fact, I'm not sure I did. The next day, I called the landlord and asked if anyone else had ever lived there before me. He hesitated, then admitted that the last tenant, a man named Jacob, had gone missing. They never found him. He disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving his car, wallet, everything behind. When I asked if he had lived alone, the landlord paused again. As far as we knew, he said. 2 nights later, I woke to find a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a man, tall and thin, his skin pale and stretched, his eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I reached for the lamp, but the light wouldn't turn on. And then he stepped forward. I must have blacked out, because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. My bedroom door was open, the sheets were damp with sweat, and my baseball bat was gone. I moved out the same day. A week later, the police found my bat in the attic of that house, leaning against the far wall in the dust, right where those bare footprints had ended. I still wonder if Jacob ever really left. Story the end. It started the day I moved into the house. I wasn't expecting much. Just a cheap 2-bedroom fixer-upper in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of Cleveland. The kind of place you find when you don't have much money, but still want a place to call your own. The real estate agent called it a diamond in the rough, but all I saw was peeling paint, creaky floors, and a yard that hadn't been mowed in months. Still, it was mine. I'd been burned out by city life, working long hours as a graphic designer, and desperately wanted a fresh start. The house sat on a dead-end street lined with older homes, some well-kept, others looking like they'd been abandoned for years. My neighbors were sparse, and the one family living closest kept mostly to themselves. On my first night, I noticed how quiet it was. No sirens, no chatter from bars or street traffic, just silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I unpacked slowly, eager to settle in. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard faint footsteps upstairs. The house had no second floor, just a cramped attic I'd already checked, locked tight. I told myself it was probably just the house settling. Old houses do that. But the footsteps didn't stop there. Night after night, the same pacing back and forth, like someone was walking just above my bedroom ceiling. Sometimes I heard faint whispers, so quiet I couldn't make out the words. I tried to record the noises on my phone, but every playback was just static and silence. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, I caught sight of a figure out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow darting past the living room window. I stepped outside, but no one was there. I told a friend about the noises and the shadow, and he laughed it off. "Old houses are creepy," he said. "You're just imagining things." But I knew better. One night, the footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. Then the floorboards creaked loudly right outside my bedroom door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. Over the next few weeks, the occurrences grew more frequent and intense. Objects moved on their own. A glass slid off the kitchen counter, a book fell from the shelf, and once my phone switched itself off and on repeatedly. I became exhausted. The exhaustion was worse than just a bad night's sleep. It was a heavy, bone-deep tiredness, like something was draining me. I started researching the house's history. According to local records, it was built in 1892 by a man named Walter Crane, a reclusive farmer who lost his wife and daughter in a tragic accident on the property. The details were vague. Some said the daughter drowned in the nearby creek, others whispered about a fire. Walter himself disappeared years later, and the house had been vacant for decades before I bought it. One night, I was woken by a cold gust of wind, even though all the windows were closed. At the foot of my bed stood a figure, a woman in a tattered dress, her face pale and eyes hollow. She stared at me silently, then vanished as I blinked. I felt my blood run cold but couldn't move. When the sun came up, I searched the house for any signs of someone living there, but found nothing. I called the landlord, who told me the house had a reputation for being haunted, but he didn't believe in ghosts. The night after that, I heard a child laughing from the attic. The sound was sweet but eerie, echoing in the small, confined space. I climbed the ladder and looked inside. Dusty boxes and old furniture were scattered everywhere, but no sign of a child. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut behind me. I jumped, but the door was stuck fast. The laughter grew louder, filling the room until it was all I could hear. I struggled for what felt like hours before the door finally creaked open. I rushed downstairs, heart pounding. I decided to leave the house for a few days. At my friend's place, I told him everything, and he urged me to call someone, maybe a priest or a paranormal investigator. Desperate, I reached out to a local paranormal group. They came the next weekend, setting up cameras and sensors. During the night, their equipment picked up temperature drops, unexplained movements, and a series of low-frequency sounds they couldn't explain. They told me the house was definitely haunted, and that the spirits seemed tied to the fan of the family that once lived there. They recommended a cleansing ritual. I agreed, even though I was skeptical. During the ritual, strange things happened. The air grew thick, the lights flickered, and I felt a sudden crushing weight on my chest. I saw the woman again, this time more clearly, her eyes pleading. She whispered, "Find her." The investigators told me to leave the house and not look back. I couldn't stop thinking about the daughter, the child's laughter, and the cold figure in my bedroom. Determined to find answers, I started digging deeper into local archives and newspaper clippings. One story caught my eye, a missing girl named Emily Crane who vanished from the area in 1897. The case was never solved. I decided to visit the creek where she was last seen. The water was cold and murky, surrounded by thick woods. As I stood by the water's edge, I heard a faint voice calling my name. I spun around but saw no one. Then, in the distance, I saw a small figure, a girl in a white dress, standing among the trees. I called out, but she vanished. From that day on, the hauntings intensified. I saw the woman more often, sometimes accompanied by a man whose face was twisted in sorrow and anger. One night, I awoke to a shadowy figure sitting on my chest, pressing down so hard I couldn't breathe. I gasped and the weight lifted. Terrified, I packed my things and left the house for good. Weeks later, I learned the house had burned to the ground in a mysterious fire. Neighbors said the flames started in the attic and spread rapidly. I still dream about that house, the woman's pleading eyes, and the lost child's laughter echoing in the dark. Sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I feel cold fingers brush my skin. Story the end. It was one of those cold October nights in Vermont when the fog rolls in thick and fast, swallowing the streets and the faint glow of porch lights. I was driving back from a friend's place, a long weekend visit to the countryside where I'd grown up. The roads were narrow and winding, surrounded by dense woods that pressed close, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. It was late, maybe 11:30, and the only sound in the car was the faint hum of the heater struggling against the chill outside. I was taking the usual shortcut, a back road I'd driven 100 times before, a little over a mile that sliced through the woods to avoid the main highway. The fog was dense tonight, the kind that makes your headlights seem useless, a white curtain that closes in tight. As I crept along, I saw something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the wet asphalt. The figure didn't move. I squinted, trying to make out any details. It was a man, tall, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He looked out of place. His face was obscured, but I swear his posture was wrong, like he was too stiff, too still. I rolled the window down and called out, "Hey, you okay? Do you need a ride?" No response. Just silence. I reached for my phone to call 911, but my battery was dead. No signal either. Great. I hesitated, debating whether to just drive around him. I didn't want to hit someone, but something in the way he stood there, like he was waiting for me, made me uneasy. I inched forward slowly, trying to pass on the left side. Then, as I got close, he suddenly stepped forward, directly into my path. I slammed the brakes again and swerved to the right, narrowly missing him. My heart was pounding in my chest. I flicked the high beams on and off, trying to see better. The figure didn't move. I panicked, put the car in reverse, and sped back to the main road. As I pulled onto the highway, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The figure was there, standing on the shoulder of the back road, just staring after me. I didn't stop driving until I was safely back in town. I told myself it was some drunk guy messing around, or maybe a prankster. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that figure was wrong. Like he wasn't just a man. The next day I asked around, but no one reported seeing anyone standing in the road that night. Later that week, strange things started happening at my apartment in Burlington. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but home. One night I heard footsteps outside my door, slow, deliberate. I looked through the peephole. Nothing. I opened the door a crack. No one there. Just the quiet hallway. The footsteps continued intermittently over the next few nights. I installed a camera hoping to catch whoever was making them. The footage was odd. It showed nothing. The hallway was empty, yet the sounds kept coming. One night, I woke up to the feeling of breath on my neck. I sat up, heart racing, but no one was there. I chalked it up to nightmares or stress. But then my phone started ringing at 3:33 a.m. every night. When I answered, there was only static. Once a faint whisper, "Leave." I started locking all my doors and windows, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I began having vivid nightmares. In them, the tall figure from the road appeared, always standing silently, waiting. His face was never clear, but his presence was overwhelming. I tried to ignore it. I even went to the local police station, but they said there was nothing they could do. One morning, I found scratches on my front door, deep and jagged, like someone had tried to claw their way inside. The wood was splintered, but no one was around. I called a locksmith to reinforce the door. After that, I noticed my dog was acting strange, growling at nothing, refusing to go near the front door. Then, one night, my electricity went out. I was alone in the dark, the silence deafening. Suddenly, I heard knocking. Slow at first, then frantic. I didn't answer. The knocking moved from the door to the windows. I sat there, frozen, clutching a flashlight. When the power came back on, I found muddy footprints on my porch. Large, human, but oddly distorted. I never saw anyone. Then came the final straw. One evening, I got home late. As I unlocked the door, I heard breathing behind me. I spun around, no one, but when I looked back at my door, it was wide open. Inside, the living room was a mess. Furniture overturned, pictures ripped off the walls. I called the police again. They found no fingerprints, no evidence. But I found something else, a note on my kitchen table. Written in smeared ink, "I'm still here." I packed my things that night and stayed with a friend. But the phone calls continued. The whispering, the footsteps, the feeling that he was just outside, waiting. I haven't returned home since. Sometimes I see a dark figure standing across the street, watching. No one else sees him, and I'm terrified that he's coming for me. Story, the end. The thing about moving to a small town, especially one so out of the way that it barely registers on any map, is that you quickly realize there are secrets that everyone pretends don't exist. When I first moved to Millfield, Ohio, it was for a fresh start. I was tired of city noise, the constant rush, and the crowds. I thought the quiet streets and thick forests would be exactly what I needed to put my life back together. But what I didn't know was that Millfield had a history, a dark shadow lurking beneath its calm surface, one that I would come face to face with in the most terrifying way imaginable. The first week I settled into my small rented house on the outskirts of town, I was excited. The house was old but sturdy, surrounded by acres of woods that stretched endlessly behind the backyard fence. The neighbors were polite but reserved, people mostly kept to themselves, the kind of folks who didn't smile much but nodded in passing. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone's business but no one talks about it. I started working at the local diner, a modest place that smelled perpetually of fried eggs and coffee. That's where I met Martha, the manager, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a voice that could cut glass. She welcomed me but immediately warned me not to wander too far into the woods. "There's things out there," she said quietly one afternoon, glancing over her shoulder. I laughed it off. Small town superstition, I thought. Ghost stories to scare kids. But there was one thing I did notice quickly. The forest wasn't just thick. It felt unnatural. Like the trees weren't just growing, but watching. The air always felt heavier there, colder even on warm days. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of something moving between the trunks. Something too big and too quick to be any animal I knew. My dog, a golden retriever named Sam, refused to go beyond the edge of the trees and would growl lowly whenever we walked near. The first strange thing happened about 2 weeks after I moved in. I was walking Sam late one night, the moon a sliver of silver in the sky. The town was quiet, the usual distant sounds of dogs barking and the occasional car engine long gone. As we neared the tree line, Sam suddenly stopped, ears perked and fur raised. I heard it then, soft tapping, like a slow, deliberate knock coming from deep inside the woods. "Hello?" I called, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the fog that had begun to settle. No answer. The tapping stopped abruptly. Sam tugged on the leash, pulling me away. I hurried back to the house, heart pounding for reasons I didn't want to admit. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that tapping over and over, echoing in my ears, even when I closed my eyes. The next day at the diner, I asked Martha about it. She looked at me with an expression that made my stomach turn. "You heard it too," she said quietly. "The tapping's been going on for years. People say it's the spirits or the old ones who never left." I pressed her for more, but she only shook her head. "Some things you don't want to know. Just don't go into the woods after dark." Despite the warning, curiosity got the better of me. I started researching the town's history. Millfield was founded in the early 1800s by settlers drawn to the fertile land and the dense timber. But around 1890, something changed. There were reports of people disappearing in the woods, sometimes found days later, delirious, and unable to explain what happened. Some never returned at all. The locals whispered about the tapping, as a sign that whatever haunted the woods was calling. One old newspaper clipping I found described an incident in 1913 where a group of hunters vanished near the creek, their campsite found in ruins. The only clue was strange markings carved into the trees and that same tapping sound reported by several witnesses. I tried to shrug it off as folklore, but the dread only grew. One evening, Sam barked wildly at the back door. I looked outside and saw nothing but darkness and fog creeping in from the woods. I closed and locked all the windows, but that night I was awoken by tapping again, this time on my bedroom window. I froze. The tapping was slow, methodical, and coming from the other side of the glass. I didn't dare look, but after what felt like hours, it stopped. The next morning, I found small scratches etched into the wooden window frame, sharp and deep like claw marks. I told myself it was some animal or prankster, but the unease was there. Days passed, and the tapping increased. It would start just after sunset, first at the windows, then on the doors, sometimes on the roof, like fingers drumming a sinister rhythm. I started noticing other things. Items in my house would be moved, keys left on the kitchen counter suddenly appeared on the floor, pictures would be turned face down, shadows flickered in corners where there was no light. One night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. Sam was growling fiercely in the hallway, hackles raised. I grabbed the flashlight and crept out of the bedroom. In the living room, the front door was wide open, swinging slightly on its hinges despite the calm night. I closed it, checked the locks, and then heard the tapping again, coming from inside the house. I followed the sound down the hall to the basement door. The basement was unfinished, dusty, and cold. I hadn't gone down there since moving in. The tapping came from the far corner, behind some old boxes. I moved them aside and found a large, ancient-looking trunk covered in dust. The tapping was louder now, almost frantic. I knelt to open the trunk, hands shaking. The lock broke easily. Inside were old clothes, yellowed papers, and a thick book bound in cracked leather. The book was covered in strange symbols I didn't recognize. I flipped through the pages, and my blood ran cold. The pages detailed rituals, summoning ceremonies, and warnings about a presence trapped beneath the woods, something ancient and malevolent that demanded tribute, marked by the tapping as a summons. I slammed the book shut. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and a deep growl filled the room. Sam snarled, backing up against me, fur bristling. A shadow moved in the corner of the basement, twisting and expanding. I scrambled upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. The house trembled. Lights flickered. The tapping became pounding, as if 1,000 nails were being hammered into the walls. I grabbed my keys and ran outside into the cold night air. The woods seemed to pulse with dark energy, the tapping echoing from every direction. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I packed my things and left Millfield. Years later, I learned the house burned down in a fire that started deep in the basement. The fire department found no cause. Neighbors claimed to see a dark figure fleeing into the woods as the flames rose. I never returned to Millfield, but sometimes when the wind is right, I still hear tapping at my window, calling me back. Story. The end. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, a long overdue weekend getaway to clear my head. I'd been stuck in the same cubicle for over 3 years, the monotony of corporate life slowly draining the life out of me. My therapist suggested a break, some fresh air, and a change of scenery. So I packed a bag, filled the tank, and set off to drive from Chicago down to the Ozarks. Nothing fancy, just a few days camping, hiking, and being alone with nature. I left early Saturday morning, the sun barely up, the city still yawning awake. The first few hours were uneventful, the interstate humming beneath the tires, the radio playing an eclectic mix of classic rock and late-night talk shows rebroadcast for early risers like me. I felt lighter, hopeful even. Maybe this trip would do me some good. Around midday, I veered off the main highway onto a smaller route, cutting through the rolling hills and dense forests of southern Missouri. The 2-lane road was lined with ancient oak trees, their branches twisting overhead like knotted fingers. The air smelled different here, fresher, heavier with earth and pine. Perfect. After about an hour, I noticed my gas gauge dipping lower than I'd like. I figured I'd stop soon at a gas station or convenience store, but the map app on my phone showed nothing nearby. No service either. The kind of spot where your phone slips into that barren, no bars, gray zone. I decided to press on, hoping to find a town or station up ahead. The road narrowed and curved, dipping into a valley thick with fog. The mist clung to the trees and settled low, swirling around my tires like something alive. Then, out of nowhere, my car sputtered. The engine coughed, and the dashboard lights dimmed. I pulled over to the shoulder, heart thumping, and tried to restart. Nothing. Dead. I cursed under my breath, pulling out my phone again. No signal. Great. I was stranded miles from anything, with only the eerie silence of the woods around me. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight, deciding to walk back up the road to see if I could find help. I wasn't worried, or at least I tried not to be. It was daylight. I could handle a little hike. The fog thickened as I walked, muffling the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. Every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the trees. A deer, maybe? A squirrel? Something watching? I shook the thought away. After about 20 minutes, I stumbled upon an old, weathered sign nailed to a post. The letters were faded but still legible. Welcome to Red Hollow. The name sent a shiver down my spine, but I pressed on, hoping for a gas station, a convenience store, maybe even a diner. Something. Anything. Eventually, I came to a small cluster of buildings, the kind of place you might miss if you blinked. A general store, a gas station with ancient pumps, a motel with a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. The place looked abandoned, but not quite, like it was waiting. I walked toward the gas station. The door was cracked open. Inside, the smell hit me. Stale coffee, old cigarettes, something metallic. I called out, but no answer. I stepped inside, the floor creaking underfoot. The shelves were dusty, stocked with canned goods and snacks long past their expiration date. Behind the counter, an old cash register sat unused. I felt a sudden cold prickling at my neck, like the air itself was watching me. Then, from the back room, I heard footsteps. "Hello?" I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. No reply, just the faint scuffling of movement. I edged toward the door to the back room and pushed it open. Empty. I frowned and stepped back out front. That's when I noticed a figure standing outside the motel across the street. A man, or maybe a boy, hard to tell in the fog. He was thin, pale, wearing ragged clothes, and he stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Hey," I said, trying to catch his attention. He didn't move, just kept staring. A knot of unease twisted in my stomach. I turned back toward the gas station, but before I could take a step, a whisper brushed against my ear, barely audible, but chilling. "Don't stay." I spun around, flashlight raised, but the street was empty except for the fog and the old buildings. I tried to shake it off and decided I should get back to my car and wait for help. As I walked down the cracked sidewalk, I noticed a rusted pickup truck parked nearby. Its windshield was cracked, the paint peeling. Suddenly, a voice behind me said, "You shouldn't be here." I whipped around. The man from the motel was closer now, his eyes dark pits. He smiled, but it was wrong, like a predator's grin. Who are you?" I asked, voice shaking. He didn't answer, just took a step closer. I backed up slowly, heart racing. "Look," I said, trying to keep calm, "my car broke down. I just need to call for help." He laughed, low, guttural. "No one comes here. No one leaves." I turned and ran back toward the gas station. The fog thickened, and shadows seemed to reach out from the trees. When I reached my car, I pulled out my phone one last time. Still no signal. The engine was cold, dead. I locked the doors and sat in the driver's seat, trying to catch my breath. Minutes passed. The fog grew denser, and the world outside the windows blurred. Then I heard scratching at the door. I stared at the window. The man's face pressed against the glass, eyes wide and wild. He mouthed words I couldn't hear. I locked the doors again, but it didn't matter. Suddenly, the lights inside the car flickered. The radio, which I hadn't touched, crackled to life, playing a static-filled song from decades ago. The man smiled wider. The door handle rattled. I grabbed the keys and tried the ignition. Still nothing. Panic set in. The back seat door creaked open by itself. I screamed and jumped out of the car, running into the fog, heart pounding, lungs burning. Branches grabbed at my clothes, the cold ground slick beneath my feet. I didn't look back. I ran until I couldn't anymore, collapsing against a tree trunk. When I looked up, the fog had cleared slightly. The motel, the gas station, the man, all gone. But the forest wasn't empty. I heard whispers, hundreds of voices murmuring just beyond hearing. I stayed there until dawn, shivering and soaked in sweat. When the sun finally rose, I found a dirt path leading away from the clearing. I followed it, walking for hours until I stumbled onto a paved road. A passing car stopped, and the driver called the police. I told them everything about the broken down car, the fog, the man, the abandoned town of Red Hollow. They looked at me like I was crazy. "There's no town named Red Hollow around here," one officer said. "No one reported anyone missing," another added. I was taken to a nearby hospital to calm down. Later, I asked about the area I described. No records, no signs of roads or buildings, just forest. That was 6 months ago. I never went back. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I catch a glimpse of fog rolling in too thick to be natural. And when I do, I swear I hear that whisper. Don't stay. Story the end. The night I moved into my new apartment, I thought I was just starting a new chapter, a fresh start in a city I barely knew. Detroit was nothing like the small town I grew up in, and the apartment, a modest third-floor unit in a brick building on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, seemed perfect for me. Affordable, close to work, and supposedly safe. I didn't know then what had happened here before I arrived. It started slowly. At first, I noticed small things, a light flickering, a strange cold draft in the hallway when no windows were open, soft noises I couldn't quite place. I told myself I was just stressed that the building was old and the plumbing and wiring were probably to blame. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. One night, I was working late on my laptop when the power went out. The whole building plunged into darkness, except for the faint red glow of the emergency exit signs. I grabbed my flashlight and walked down the hall to check the fuse box. As I passed my neighbor's door, I heard it, soft scratching on the other side like nails dragging slowly against wood. I paused, heart pounding, but when I called out, there was no answer. A few days later, I found a small, crudely carved wooden figurine outside my door. It was a twisted, almost grotesque little thing, like someone had tried to sculpt a person but had stopped halfway. I showed it to a coworker who went pale and whispered something about old folk legends. That night, the noises got worse. I heard whispers, low and garbled, coming from the vents. My dog, Max, growled constantly at nothing I could see. I started seeing shadows move just beyond the edge of my vision. I asked the building manager if anything strange had happened here before. He hesitated, then admitted that years ago, a young woman had disappeared from the building. They never found her. Some tenants refused to stay because of unexplained noises, but no one could prove anything. One night, I woke up to a cold hand gripping my ankle. I screamed, but Max barked frantically, attacking the empty air. When I looked, nothing was there. I knew then I wasn't alone. The worst was when I found an old diary tucked behind a loose brick in the basement wall. It belonged to the missing woman, and her last entries spoke of a dark presence stalking her, something that whispered in the night and wanted to take her away. I couldn't stay. I packed my things and left the next morning, but sometimes, even now, I hear the scratching, the whispers, and I know whatever was in that building still waits in the shadows. Story. The end. The night I realized something was horribly wrong started like any other quiet evening. I worked the late shift at a convenience store in a small town nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody and strangers stand out like sore thumbs. Most nights were uneventful. Just the hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional customer buying a pack of cigarettes or a bottle of cheap whiskey, and the ticking clock counting down the hours until morning. That night, though, something felt off from the moment I unlocked the front door. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes the darkness feel heavier than usual. I remember looking up at the sky through the cracked glass door. No stars, just a dense, rolling cloud cover swallowing everything in shadow. I shrugged it off as the weather about to turn. Storms were common this time of year. But the street lights outside flickered in a way I hadn't noticed before, casting an eerie glow across the empty parking lot. I flipped the sign to open, switched on the lights, and started my shift. Around 10:30 p.m., a man walked in. Nothing unusual, just a lanky figure wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, jeans, and a thin jacket zipped halfway up. He moved with a kind of stiffness, like he was trying to hide something or didn't want to be noticed. His eyes darted nervously around the store, barely meeting mine. "Can I help you?" I asked, already knowing the answer would probably be just looking, but I'd ask anyway out of habit. He mumbled something I didn't catch and shuffled over to the candy aisle. He didn't grab anything but stood there staring at the shelves like he was trying to memorize them. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, but I told myself he was just a restless drifter passing through. A few minutes later, he approached the counter holding a single pack of gum. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the counter. I rang it up, took his money, and gave him his change. As he turned to leave, I noticed something strange, a faint, sour smell, like old blood mixed with rust. When the door closed behind him, I locked it instinctively, even though the store was open for another 2 hours. I told myself it was paranoia. Maybe the guy was just sick. About an hour later, a woman came in. She looked around my age, mid-20s, dressed in workout clothes, carrying a duffel bag. She smiled politely and asked if I had any bottled water and energy drinks. I handed her a couple of bottles, and she paid with exact change. She chatted briefly about the heat and how she'd been out hiking all day, which made sense given the area. As she left, I thought I saw her glance nervously over her shoulder at the darkened parking lot, but I shrugged it off again. Around midnight, things took a turn. The electricity flickered and hummed before the lights dimmed to nearly nothing. The fluorescent tubes buzzed louder, and I realized the old wiring in this building wasn't handling the humidity well. The emergency lights kicked on, casting a dim red glow. The store felt colder all of a sudden, despite the summer heat outside. The woman who'd left earlier should have been well gone by then. I checked the security cameras, but the feed was static, like someone had unplugged the system. A sense of dread settled deep in my chest. I told myself to keep calm, finish the shift, and go home. Then the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. It was a local code, but I had never seen it before. I answered hesitantly. Hello? Silence. Just a faint static hiss, and then a voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The line went dead. I dropped the receiver, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst through my ribcage. The fluorescent lights flickered again, and the air felt thicker, like something unseen was pressing in from all sides. I tried to call the police, but the line was dead. The front door rattled as though someone was trying to open it from outside. I locked it tight, but the knocking started soon after. 3 sharp knocks, spaced evenly. I backed away toward the storage room in the back, trying to steady my breathing. The knocks continued, growing louder, faster. I looked out the window and saw a figure standing beneath the street lamp, but the light didn't reach him clearly. Just a silhouette, tall and unmoving, his head tilted at an odd angle. I grabbed a metal broomstick from the corner and moved toward the back door. As I passed the counter, the cash register drawer sprang open by itself, slamming shut with a metallic bang. Fear clawed at me. I was about to call the cops again when the power cut out completely, plunging the store into blackness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight, and the screen illuminated the silhouette again, now pressed up against the glass front door. The man from earlier. But his face was different. His eyes were empty pits, black and endless, staring straight through me. He raised a hand and tapped 3 times on the glass, slow and deliberate. The phone slipped from my fingers. I ran to the back exit, throwing open the door into the humid night, gasping for air. No one was there, just the thick woods on either side of the road, silent and still. I drove home, not daring to look back. When I finally locked myself inside my apartment, I realized my phone had no signal. I haven't been back to that town since. Story the end.